Those are wonderfully appropriate songs for our study and our discussion tonight. I want to ask everyone, please, to open your New Testaments to Luke, the 16th chapter. There are no slides tonight, no 3 points, none of that kind of stuff. I really just want everybody here to be looking at Luke 16 as we walk through these 31 verses and try to piece together the things that Jesus is trying to show us. At the end of Luke 16, the back half is a story we know pretty well. You've probably read about and talked about the story of the rich man and Lazarus many times. We will spend a small amount of time on that at the end of the lesson. It is somewhat debated. People wonder whether it's a parable of a true event or a made-up event. Some people wonder whether we'll still go to paradise like that when we die, or now that Jesus has ascended, if it's somewhere else. But none of that really hits at the actual point for which it was given, though I think it's kind of unmistakable. We know it pretty well. One man had all of these goods and kept them for himself, and he lost everything in the end. That's a story we know pretty well. Now, at the beginning of Luke 16 is kind of like the opposite end of the spectrum. Of all of the parables that Jesus told, many of which he spells out the answers for you, like this one, to me, this is the most challenging, debated one that I've ever studied or read about. Sometimes we just try to plug in like sarcasm from Jesus just to make it figurative so we'll understand it better. I think we can do better than that tonight. So we're going to try to figure out the parable first. There's this odd little verse right in the middle, verse 18, about divorce and remarriage, like I said this morning, that seems to fit nothing that's going on in the context. We'll talk a little bit about why that's there, but ultimately I hope that the entire thing ties together for you. So let's jump right in. I want to read the first 8 verses of Luke chapter 16 and this particular story that Jesus told. Now he was also saying to the disciples, verse 1, there was a rich man who had a manager, and this manager was reported to him as squandering his possessions. And he called him and said to him, what is this I hear about you? Give an accounting of your management, for you can no longer be manager. The manager said to himself, verse 3, what shall I do, since my master is taking the management away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I shall do, so that when I am removed from the management, people will welcome me into their homes. And he summoned each one of his master's debtors, and he began saying to the first, how much do you owe my master? And he said, 100 measures of oil. And he said to him, take your bill, sit down quickly, and write 50. Then he said to another, how much do you owe? Verse 7. He said, 100 measures of wheat. He said, take your bill and write 80. And his master, who I would think would be even more furious, praised him. His master praised the unrighteous manager because he acted shrewdly. For the sons of this age are more shrewd or cunning or wise in relation to their own kind than, as Jesus is saying, even the sons of light. So there's the parable. What in the world is that about? Now, what often throws us off is, this is not a good man. It is not your job in this story to go, first of all, let me figure out how he actually really was a good man. Not a good man. It's like the parable a chapter or two later about the unrighteous judge who didn't care about anybody. He didn't care about anybody, and he's a bad guy. But he answered to persistence, and Jesus used his answering to persistence as the point. In this case, this is a bad dude. This guy has squandered the possessions. He's about to lose everything. And now, who is he looking out for? Himself. He's going, I'm about to get kicked out. I'm about to have nothing. So here's what I will do. I will use the little bit of power I have left. I will take the small things, most of which aren't even mine, like this money isn't even mine. I will use what I have right now to somehow gain friends who can help me later. That's what he did. He used a little bit of influence he had now to garner friendships that would help him further on down the road. And this is what his master is saying. His master isn't saying, wow, you really proved yourself. I think I'll keep you. No, he's out of there. He's like, you're gone. But I am impressed with you that when it came down to it and you understood that this present life, follow me, is ending. That you're not going to get to keep this position, and you blew it. You understood that there was a little bit of time left and a few remaining resources that you could invest into people, following me? And when this is over, you get what's next. That's the story. Now, I hope I explained it in a way that's already helping it to make some sense, because Jesus comes in with what for me is probably the most important verse of this whole thing, where he tries to explain it to people. We see that there's a shrewdness, a wisdom, a looking out for himself found in verse 8. Verse 9, here's Jesus' point. Here's what I say to you, disciples. Make friends for yourselves by means of the wealth, New American Standard is what I'm reading from, by the wealth of unrighteousness, so that when it fails, they will receive you into the eternal dwellings. Now here's problem number one here. We have difficulty figuring out what the wealth of unrighteousness is. It sounds like filthy lucre or greed-based earnings, like your pocket's filled with stuff that you shouldn't have. That is not what he's saying here. When he says, take your wealth of unrighteousness to make friends with it, he's just talking about the wealth of this world. He's saying compared to the true riches, verse 11. I'm getting ahead of us just a little bit, but he's going to compare it, verse 11, to the true riches. Compared, how much money, everyone pull the money you got out in your pocket. I want to see it right now. Why don't you hold up nope, okay. Because you're afraid what might happen next. It might be one of those magic tricks that has a fire in it. But look, everything you've got in your pocket, everything you've got in your bank account, everything invested in your home is wealth of unrighteousness, not in that it is sinful, but in that compared to the true riches of where we're trying to go and what we're really here for, it's basically nothing. And he's kind of using that play on words. Like this guy was actually unrighteous and he used his wealth. Even in his unrighteousness, he used the wealth he had wisely, and you need to use that same stuff wisely also. So what's his point, verse 9? His point is, listen, you don't have a lot of time here left on this earth. And you have some resources, not a whole bunch, some of us a little more, some a little less. It's unrighteous stuff, and that it's all going to pass away. What you need to do is take it out of your pocket. Take it out of your life and don't store it up. You need to go make friends with it. All right, we're going to buy some friends, you and me. We're going to go out and buy some friends so that when it fails, and it will fail, and wealth always fails, and your physical life always fails, and you're completely gone, then, verse 9, you get to go into the eternal dwellings. You guys see the connection? What interests me most about this story is, what do you mean by making friends? Like, can I go buy off some angels or something? Like, here's some money. And they're like, I'll see you when we get there. Now, that's kind of the interesting part of it. When he says make friends, what he's saying is there are spiritual people on this earth who are going to heaven. You believe that, right? There are spiritual people on this earth who are going to be in heaven, who are going to be there later. You need to be willing to take your time, your resources, and your money. It's all passing and little and unrighteous anyway. And use it to build a relationship with those people. You say, I don't think there should be a connection between money and spirituality. Was anybody here this morning when we read from Acts chapter 2? Was anybody here? We'll read it at the end if it'll help, where they actually sold their things. They sold goods, they sold land, and they just gave it, and they said, hey, I just want to take care of Christians. Let me just tell you something, a little tip for life. Take care of Christians. Because when all this is gone, and the Lord comes back and gets to heaven, guess who's going to be there? Christ and Christians. And I kind of want to be with them, if you know where I'm coming from. And so what he's saying is, what this unrighteous guy was saying is, when this life is over, and I blew it, it's over. When this life is over, I want the people in the next life to accept me. Now, any idea that says, Kris, those are totally separate things. You use your money for what you use it for here. You do what you want to do with it here. When you get to heaven, then we'll start serving each other. Listen to me speak. Then we'll start giving. Then it won't be about us anymore. Then we'll start making sacrifices. You lie. I call lie. That's a self-taught lie. Oh, now I got to garner and keep and get and have and maybe cut a few corners, just make sure. But when I get there, I'm going to lay it all at the Lord's feet. No, you won't. You're not going to cast your crown at the Lord's feet. You're going to start measuring it to make sure it weighs more than everybody else's crown. Except you're not even going to be there to do that. This is where he's going with this idea of connecting the way that we use our funds with the decisions that we make. Let me see if I can help you further. Jesus keeps talking about it. Verse 9 is kind of his moment where he says, this is what you need to do. And one more thing I'd add about verse 9. The friends you make may not all be Christians, but you still should be using your goods to make friends with them. What story might I be referencing? If I was going to make that point that we need to be using our time and energy and resources and funds to invest in a heavenly future, it wouldn't just be for Christians, and I would probably take you to the story of the what? The Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan used his time and energy and resources to help a total stranger. Did that stranger go to heaven or not? I don't know if he went to heaven or not, but I know Jesus is in heaven, and you're going to make friends with Jesus if you help that guy. I don't know if that guy's going to be in heaven or not, but I know Jesus is going to be in heaven. Make friends with Jesus by the use of what you have in your pocket and in your life. I'm telling you, every year when we read through Luke, it just hits me that I've tried to disconnect something that God's not allowing me to disconnect. And that is these goods compared to those. Here's how he picks it up and keeps going. Let's read verses 10 through 13, and you'll see exactly how this comes together. Verse 10. He who is faithful in a very little thing is faithful also in much. And he who is unrighteous in a very little thing is unrighteous also in much. Therefore, if you have not been faithful in the use of unrighteous wealth, it's got like presidents on it. It's worldly. Who will entrust the true riches to you? And if you have not been faithful in the use of that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? No servant can have two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. And then he kind of drops the imagery here and says, let me just tell you exactly what I'm talking about. You cannot serve God and money and wealth and mammon and goods and things. Now, if you're willing to do a little bit of marking, I hope you carry a pencil with you around here. If you're willing to do a little bit of marking, I would have you circle a few things. In verse 9, I circled wealth of unrighteousness, which I've tried to define so far as just monetary things, the passing things, the fiscal things of this world. Then in verse 10, you circle very little thing. When you get home tonight, I want you to pull up your bank account and look at those numbers and go, very little. You might be like, I don't need to pull it up to know that, Kris. Very little thing. That's a little thing. I don't care how big it is. It's a little thing. He goes on to say, verse 11, unrighteous wealth. I would only circle that because it's the same thing again. Then in verse 12, I would circle it is what? Another's. It's a really interesting thing. You know, all of our money here and our goods, he says it's not even really yours because it's not the true gift. It's just something that you happen to have. It will belong to another sooner rather than later. The government may, the whole Ecclesiastes thing. The government may take it from you. The economy may turn. There may be war. You may get hit by a bus, whatever. Like, it's not even really yours anyway because you only get it for a little while to do the best things you can with it, and then it goes on to somebody else, right? That's the idea. And so I'm circling all these things, and then verse 13, I would circle wealth. So that explains to you that the wealth of unrighteousness is the very little thing, which really isn't even ours, and it's just wealth. It's talking about your goods and your money. Now, I want you to understand something that it takes faith to see. God says this. He says, while you live this life, no matter where or when you live, I'm going to put some money in your pocket. I'm going to put some energy in your body. It's a little thing. It really is a little thing. You're going to live this long here and that long in eternity. But I'm going to tell you this. If you can't use that for the work of Christ, if you can't use, how many of you are parents? If your child can't take care of a fish, you're not going to give them a puppy, right? If they can't take care of like one of those little digital pets that really you can just turn it off whenever you want, I'm not going to give you a real one. Well, what the Lord is saying is, if I put stuff in your pocket and in your life and you feel like you've got to hoard it and be like that guy later, Lazarus and the rich man, then do you think you're going to get to heaven's gates and I'm going to go, okay, now I'm going to give you what is truly yours because you're so good at hoarding it that I know? No. He's going to say, I want you to live by faith on this. I want to give you more than you can ever imagine. And I don't want it to be someone else's, something that can be stolen by war or squandered. I want to give you riches that are yours, that you will keep forever and ever and ever. But life is a test. All of it is a test, including how you use I'll turn it around. I'm here with you. how I use my time and resources and life and energy and all of it. This is a lot like Matthew 6, chapter 6, which is actually kind of mentioned in our text. But look in Matthew 6, verses 19 through 21. I want to add just a little curveball to Matthew 6, 19 through 21. We know that verse pretty well. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, Matthew 6:19, where thieves break in or steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, where thieves do not break in or steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Now, I've taught that 100 times. I know everything I'm supposed to say about that. I'm supposed to tell you that verse 19 says not, and verse 20 says but, and it's a Bible idiom, it's a figure of speech, and it means you can save money in this life, you can have a bank account, you can have a 401k retirement, you can have a 3-story mansion in Sedona. Nope. Okay, probably not, but you can do all that. But, more importantly, you need to be laying up treasure. I mean, everybody knows this. I'm back to like 101 elementary stuff for a moment. But more important than that, you need to be laying up treasures in heaven. But I've got a question for you. How do you do that? It sounds good. Rodney, let's lay up treasures in heaven. Let's make sure we've got this big account in heaven. Okay, great. How do we do it? You know what Jesus is teaching us in this story? You're going to have to use this to do that. You can't do that without using this. The text in Matthew 6, 19 through 21 isn't just don't store up this, but store up that. It's use this to store up that. And, you know, in the first century, it's interesting Jesus makes this point in the first century because they were mostly all super dirt poor. They really had nothing. So when he was talking about that, he's talking about this widow and her 2 pennies. You remember that story? Luke 21, he's like, this widow and her 2 pennies, you guys put in your excess. You put in what you had left over. It didn't hurt you. It didn't affect you. She put in all that she had. He was talking to impoverished Jewish refugees. And he's saying, use whatever you can pull together to make relationships that will benefit you in eternity. What would Jesus say if I was sitting there with you and he was preaching this story to wealthy people like us? How much more must we understand the value of this point? Now go back to our text then, let's pick it up. Application-wise, there are lots of things that you can do with verses 6 through 13. We have to make a choice in verse 13. You cannot serve God in wealth. You must serve God with your wealth. That's the point of the story. I could have summed it up. We could already be out of here. Serve God with your wealth. Now, what does that look like? What are applications? I've written some down, but I don't really want to make any for you because these are decisions that you have to make. One of the things we've tried to do better at home is budget every month and put charity and giving at the top. Like first thing that's going to happen in our home, and it was really pathetic at first. It's probably still kind of pathetic, but it was really pathetic at first. And I'm thankful for the grace of God, and I'm also thankful that God admires direction over position because my position is never really great, but I'm always trying to move to a better place. I think God values that and I'm really thankful. So for us, it started with just how about we set aside funds for charity and others and giving to the work of the Lord first before anything else happens, before we buy or own anything else. Application of this would be charity, giving, kindness to others, being a good Samaritan, being hospitable and opening our wonderful homes that have all doubled in value in the last 4 weeks, sharing of goods, sharing when it hurts, sharing beyond where it hurts. When it comes to your work, let's think about it from the other side. You can't use up your whole life, gentlemen. You can't consume your whole life earning money and miss out on countless opportunities to serve and love for the purpose of garnering, unless you're planning on a big fat giveaway. But you know, guys that work that hard aren't just going to want to give that stuff away. And now we've kind of missed it on both sides. Now we're working to get, and we work so hard to get it that we don't really want to give it, and you can always call out a candidate. These are important things to understand because this story is hard on purpose. And not everybody wants to get it. And I'm going to show that to you next. Pick up with me in verse 14, and I'll read down through verse 18. Pharisees are listening. They do not like this. They don't like this lesson about as much as you don't like this lesson, except they really loathe Jesus. And so let's see what they have to say, or what they're thinking. Look in verse 14. Now the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, were listening to all these things and were scoffing at him. He said to them, you are those who justify yourselves in the sight of men, but God knows your hearts. For that which is highly esteemed among men is detestable in the sight of God. The law and the prophets were proclaimed until John. Since that time, the gospel of the kingdom of God has been preached, and everyone's trying to force their way into it. Everybody wants the blessings. Let me tell you what I'm convinced that means. Everybody wants the blessings of the kingdom, but very few people want to do what Jesus said to get them. Every time I see the word forced in, I don't think they mean like forced entry to break in and steal. I think they mean, and this goes back to John the Baptist. You guys remember when John the Baptist was preaching a baptism of repentance? Who showed up? A bunch of Pharisees going, baptize us. We want whatever you're given, we want it. He said, you can't just force your way down into this water and take it. You have to receive the instructions. And so as he moves on, he gives an example. He says, it's easier for heaven and earth, verse 17, to pass away than for one stroke of the letter of the law to fail. Everyone who divorces his wife, and this is the thing that's kind of left field, like what's this doing here? Everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and he who marries one who is divorced from a husband commits adultery. The exception clause we talk about is not in this particular rendering because that's not the point. Here's what I want you to see first. The Pharisees loved money. So as soon as they started hearing a sermon on charity, on giving, on using this to get that, what does it say they began doing? I'm really good at this. Kris, you may be good. I'm better at this. They began justifying themselves. Well, it's a good point, but when you really look at my life and kind of what I'm doing with it and the attitude that I have and the things that I do over here, we like distraction. You know, all right, take your mind off the money for a while. Let me show you some of these other tricks I can do. They wanted to justify. In other words, they wanted to say, we don't really want to do that. Like Barnabas did. Remember him when he just sold his stuff? He goes, hey, Christians need it. Here. We don't really want to do that. So what we would like to do is focus on the other things that we do really, really well. He said, you know the reason you're doing that? Because your heart's not right. Your heart is tied to the love of money. And to me, verses 16, 17, and 18, which is probably the hardest part, why did he throw this story in? I think he's just giving them an example out of left field. He's saying, hey, let me give you a quick example of what I'm talking about. You guys remember when Moses taught about divorce and him talking to them? You guys remember when Moses taught about divorce and he made that law because of the hardness of your hearts that you could put your wife away and you could marry someone else? And you guys remember, he's talking to them, how I showed up and said, hey, that's not the way this goes. From the very beginning of time, you're to stay with that person. And if you divorce that person for any cause other than adultery and you marry another, you're an adulterer. He's like, remember when I told you guys that? You guys have been trying to force your way around that since the day that I said it. But no one can force their way around my Jesus law on divorce and remarriage and be godly. Are we still fighting that battle? We are. There are still people who do not accept what God said about marriage and who do not accept what God said about divorce and remarriage, and they want to kind of not talk about that and yet get in. You know anybody? I'm about to turn this around on you, so don't fall in too deep into the trap. You know anybody like that? You know anybody in an unlawful marriage with the wrong idea about marriage, and you're trying to tell them, hey, don't you want to go to heaven? And they're like, I do want to go to heaven, but I think I'm going to be okay. And you're going, you're not going to be okay. You guys know anybody like that? You know what Jesus' point is? A lot of my disciples are like that with their money. Ouch. A lot of the disciples act just like the go around the divorce thing, go around the remarriage thing, make up this new rule thing, justify this way. They do it with the $10 in their pockets. That's his point. This is just an example to illustrate that point. You say, well, no, maybe he's turning to something else. Nope, because now we get to our story. And we all know this story really, really well. So let's read it together. We don't have as much to say about that. But let's begin in verse 19. You know the story of the rich man and Lazarus. This time you have a lot of context going into that story. Because you know about the parable of the unrighteous steward who used what he had now. He used the little bit he had now to make sure he had a place later. And you know that's what it's about. Now let's read it. He said starts in the same way as verse 1. Verse 19. Now look, there was a rich man. He habitually dressed in purple and fine linen, joyously living in splendor every day. And there was a poor man named Lazarus. Lazarus was laid at the gate. He was covered with sores. He was longing to be fed with the crumbs which were falling from the rich man's table. Besides, even the dogs were coming and licking his sores. Now the poor man died and was carried away by the angels into Abraham's bosom. And the rich man, he also died and he also was buried. In Hades, He lifted up his eyes being in torment, and he saw Abraham far away and Lazarus in his bosom. And he cried out and said, Father Abraham, have mercy on me. Send Lazarus. Now he knows his name, right? Send Lazarus so that he may dip the tip of his finger in water and cool off my tongue, for I'm in agony in this flame. And here's kind of the point. This is Jesus' point in the earlier story. Child, remember during your life, that big, beautiful, bountiful, perfect, eternal, no, that temporary, limited life. Remember that life? You had all the good stuff. You kept all the good stuff. You had more good stuff than most people. And right next to you, verse 25, was Lazarus, and he had none of those things. He was in need, and you did not help him. Now, he is being comforted here, and the tables have turned. Jesus talks about how it's hard for a rich man to get to heaven. A lot of tables are going to turn, and you are in agony. He said, besides all this, between us and you, there's this great chasm fixed, so that those who wish to come over from here to you will not be able, and none may cross over from there to us. And he said, then I beg you, Father, that you send him to my father's house. I have 5 brothers, in order that he may warn them, so that they will not also come to this place of torment. But Abraham said, they have Moses and the prophets. They have the word. Let them hear them. But he said, no, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent. But he said to them, if they do not listen to the word, to the Moses and the prophets, they will not be persuaded, even if someone rises from the dead. That is a powerful last statement, because someone did rise from the dead, and there are still millions of people who couldn't care less. That's a very powerful statement. If you don't have the faith in your heart to see how limited this is, and how piercingly short and uncertain it is, and how you have a very small amount of time to show God what you want, even if someone rose on the 3rd day, it wouldn't change you. And he's right about that. Especially if Lazarus showed up. They would probably discredit him. Lazarus had little. He had little to live on, and he had little to give. You say, well, why didn't Lazarus give to others then? He didn't have anything to give. But he had a relationship with God. The rich man had much, but he kept it. He had a heart for it. He did not have a heart for his brother. Little did he know. Little did he know. I wrote this down. I put 5 stars beside it. Little did he know that poor man, I'm thinking verse 9. Everybody peek back at verse 9 when I say this. Little did he know that poor, destitute, sore-covered man, that was the friend. That guy was the friend that he was going to need in heaven. He didn't use his unrighteous mammon, worldly things to help that friend. So that friend goes to heaven. And he didn't do anything for Lazarus during his life, and Lazarus could do nothing for him in the afterlife, because the friendship was not built. Abraham talks about how he could send someone, but they wouldn't repent, and all they need is Moses and the prophets. And I know we use this story a lot. What I want you to think about more next time you're using this story with someone is just remember it in context. It's really easy to talk to someone who's not a Christian and say, look, even if someone came back from the dead, you've just got to do what the Bible says. And we go to Acts 2:38 or something, but that's not the point of the story. The point is, they had Moses and the prophets, and you have Luke 16, verse 9. They had Moses and the prophets. You have Luke 16, verse 9. What are you going to do with it? Let's read it one more time. I say to you, make friends for yourselves by means of the wealth of unrighteousness, so that when it fails, those friends will receive you into the eternal dwellings. Could be a stranger. It's definitely a Christian. I want to finish with this. You guys have been great in this study. I know that today was a little different the way we've done things. But since we started in Acts 2, I just want to give you a place to start. You may be overwhelmed. You may go home and be like, man, I really got to rethink what I'm doing with my life, and I just need to start helping somebody. And then we start going through this. I'm reading this really audiobook. Are you allowed to say you're reading something if you're listening to it? I think Tony says he reads a lot of books. I think he listens to all of them. I'm listening to this book called Soundtracks by John Acuff. Highly recommend this book on soundtracks. He said there's these broken soundtracks that play in your head all the time, and they're usually negative. And they just play and play and play in the background, and they affect everything you do. And throughout this week, it's just going to start playing all those old deals. Well, I don't know what that guy would do with it if I gave it to him. and how all that negative thing that's kept you from doing what's right, things that have not been true or helpful or kind, that's the three-way test you need to run all your thoughts through. Is it even true, what I'm thinking right now? Would Jesus say it's true? Is it helpful to me or to anyone else? And is it kind? And what I want you to do is not let that happen, but you might wonder, well, where do we start? Well, let me just say this. Christians will always start with the household of God. So let's finish with what we read this morning. Here is where it should begin. I'm talking about time, energy, devotion of character, funds, whatever it is. In verse 41, let's just read it and we'll be done. Those who had received his word, Acts 2:41, were baptized. And that day there were added 3,000 Christian souls. They were continually, ongoingly devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to breaking of bread, and to prayer. I got to believe that cost them some time. I don't think they got that into 5 minutes. I think they automatically started trading in temporal time for eternal glory right away. It wasn't money, it was time. We're going to trade this in for this. Everyone kept feeling a sense of awe. Many wonders and signs were taking place through the apostles. All of those who had believed were together, verse 44. They had all things in common. Then it gets real, you know. They began selling their property and their possessions and were sharing them with all, as anyone might have need. Now, I know, and we talked about it in class today, you might say, well, that was a unique circumstance. There were people who were in Jerusalem from all over the world, and they weren't expecting to stay very long, and now we have the church and the kingdom, and they're staying, and that was a unique circumstance. And nobody can answer this next question but you. Nobody but you and me on our own. Okay, what if you owned some property that you'd worked really hard for, and you were a first century Jerusalem Christian, and Christians were staying extra months? Would you sell that property to house those Christians? You say, well, it's not like that. Okay, well, what if it was? What if it was? And more importantly, how many smaller, regular, daily, weekly opportunities do we have? Day by day, verse 46, continuing with one mind in the temple, breaking bread from house to house. They were taking their meals together. There's food involved. There's service involved. There's worship involved. With gladness and sincerity of heart, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord was adding to their number day by day those who are being saved. We finished both sermons with this today. I don't see a lot of begrudgment. Begrudgment is definitely not a word, but I still don't see it. I don't see a lot of, not another sacrifice lesson, not another giving lesson, not another less of this, more of that. I see a people so in awe and thankful and rejoicing in who Jesus had made them to be together that it was the greatest pleasure of their life to sacrifice a little bit of this for a lot of that. People in the world know how to look out for themselves. Maybe it's time that we look out for ourselves also. When's the last time a preacher said, you know, you really should be looking out for number one? But do it the right way. Think about you in heaven and what you need to do now to make sure that happens. You're going to make some friends along the way, and they may end up in heaven too. And the Lord will rejoice as he adds. If you're someone who needs to rethink your purpose, your planning, your life, we just want to encourage you in that. We want to help you with that. If you just come up to me right now and say, Kris, give me a vehicle. I'll give you Luke's truck. Like, we're just here to give. He's got to learn, you know. I am not where I need to be. Front row, first person. I am not where I need to be on this. But as I said earlier, the grace of God and his mercy is so rich. It's new, rich. It's new every morning. And God is looking for direction. Your position's never going to be good enough. The question for you tonight is, what direction are you heading with the way you're using the resources in your life, and that is your life? Let's do that. Let's head in the right direction together. Can we do that? You can come forward now and be encouraged as we stand and sing.